Good morning, everybody. A very warm welcome to you all. I want to start by apologizing for my voice. I've had a sort of strange cough and cold, so if it goes a bit weird during this webinar, please do excuse me. So today we are going to talk about the results of South Africa's recent elections and what these results mean for South Africans and the immense challenges that the country is facing, as well as for foreign policy and the role of South Africa in the world as an increasingly influential middle power. Middle powers are playing a much larger role in moving the global agenda forward at a time of global turmoil. They could be instrumental in forming a new multilateralism to help solve global challenges. Thus, the EPC's Europe in the World programme will be giving a greater focus to the role and impact of middle powers in our work going forward. I would say that for many people, the election result came as something of a shock. If it didn't, I'm sure our speakers will correct me, particularly the ruling ANC, which had been ruling for 30 years. Perhaps they thought that they would be ruling again for another 30 years. For the first time, the ANC has had to form a coalition to govern. South Africa now has a much bigger and more politically diverse administration, and it took quite a long time actually to get this new government together. I think it was several weeks of quite difficult inter-party negotiations and political compromise to form this new government. I believe that the new executive has 75 ministers and deputies, with 11 parties represented in the new government. That's a hell of a lot of people. I think it's the largest cabinet South Africa has ever had, perhaps the largest that any country has actually ever had. I'm sure my speakers will say a few words about this. So give us this deep dive into South Africa's politics and what we can expect. We are really joined by a great panel of speakers. First of all, Stephen Gruzd, Head of African Governance and Diplomacy Programme and the Russian Africa Project at the South African Institute of International Affairs, otherwise known as SAIIA. Christopher Vandome, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Africa Programme at Chatham House. And last but certainly not least, Delphine Malard, who is Deputy Head of Division for South Africa and Indian Ocean at the European External Action Service in Brussels. So welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. So I want to start with you, Stephen, if I may, to talk a bit about the election result and maybe a very simple question to start. I mean, were you greatly surprised by how the election turned out? The last time that we spoke, when EPC was in South Africa in April, there seemed to be a lot of concerns about whether or not the ANC would get re-elected due to corruption allegations and economic stagnation and inequality. So did it come as a huge surprise to you, the election result?
Thanks, Amanda, and good morning, everybody. For me, I was surprised. I was one of those who felt that the polls were wrong. They were indicating a massive drop in ANC support. I thought, given the fact that it's the incumbent, that it seemed to have got over its financial problems, it would mount a strong campaign in the stretch coming up to the vote and would defy expectations and just get over the 50%. I was very wrong. As you said, the ANC got 40% of the vote. The Democratic Alliance came in second with just over 20% of the vote. The third biggest party was Jacob Zuma's new Umkhonto weSizwe party with 15% of the vote, and the Economic Freedom Fighters dropped slightly to about 9 or 10% of the vote. But what we also saw was a very fractured opposition offering to the voter. There were in some cases, tens of candidates or tens of parties on the ballot. And as you said, a number of them have been taken into this government of national unity, which has 32 full cabinet members and 43 deputies, a very bloated cabinet. But this is the model that South Africa has been selling to the world, because this was very much what happened in the negotiations for a democratic South Africa in the early 90s, where everybody was given a stake in the outcome. It's the peace building model that South Africa has used wherever it's gone to try and make peace, be that in the DRC or Burundi or places like Sri Lanka or even Northern Ireland, that this inclusive big cabinet where everybody is part of the system is a popular model, and we'll see if it works. I mean, it's not the first time South Africa has had a government of national unity. After the 1994 elections, they didn't have to, but they decided to bring in the National Party and the Inkatha Freedom Party, and that only lasted for 2 years. I've spoken to some analysts, and some say they don't give this government 6 months. But the other thing to say is that there has been quite a bit of experience of coalitions and unfortunately unstable ones at local government level, in the big cities, in some of the smaller municipalities. There have been party coalitions that have been set up. Some of them have been brought down when it didn't suit the politicians. We've also got a number of provinces that have had to compromise. But the last thing I'll say in these introductory remarks is that it seems to me that the ANC pretty much outmaneuvered the Democratic Alliance in the final arrangements at national level. The DA was asking for 10 ministries. It only got 6, and some of them are quite minor. The Democratic Alliance leader, John Steenhuisen, is Minister of Agriculture, for example. He's not the Foreign Minister. He's not the Minister of Trade and Infrastructure. But they did get some key posts. But my feeling is that by making the government of unity so big, it diluted the power that the Democratic Alliance would have. But I still think cabinet meetings are going to be very interesting, and the country is hoping that the fact that the ANC didn't get a majority in the election will mean that there is more compromise, that there is more discussion, that there is more debate on policies, including foreign policy. I think I'll end my remarks there, and thank you.
No, thank you, Stephen. And I apologize, I forgot to mention at the beginning that to the audience, if you want to ask a question, you can write it in the chat box, or you can click on the hand icon, and please do that. I want to put the same question to you actually now. Chris, do you share Stephen's assessment? Do you think that this balance of power is it sustainable? Will all of these parties be able to work together harmoniously and for the same objectives?
Yeah, I think I broadly agree with Stephen's analysis there, particularly on, this is a bloated government. This is a government that is a function of political compromise rather than one that is being kind of strategically put together to be able to deliver on a common vision. And so that in itself is a problem, in that there isn't a common shared vision amongst the parties of this government. There's a lot of unanswered questions still there, including, as has been pointed out, at what time, when is the best moment in time for opposition parties to undermine this coalition? And what are the incentives for them to keep going? But kind of to delve into the election a bit deeper, I think one of the big surprises was the rise of MK, and then what could have been a falling apart of MK. I did a pre-election assessment for a possible international observation mission at the end of last year. We interviewed all the party leaders, and we interviewed a number of analysts, and no one had flagged MK. We didn't even reach out to them. We didn't interview them. They just weren't a political player. And then over the course of 4 months from the beginning of this year, all of a sudden they take over the scene. Now, there's a couple of things going on there. One, yes, the narrative of victimhood that the former president, Jacob Zuma, was able to craft did resonate with a lot of people. Two, yes, there is a certain level of Zulu ethno-nationalism imbued in the party, but that really needs to be understood a lot better, because it's not quite yet clear if there's really a kind of if that's really the case, or if it's just the case that that's where the mobilizers were, that's where the organizers for the party were. Yes, it's partly that, but there's also other things going on within that province. Including kind of, they did have a manifesto that was kind of economically left and socially right that does resonate with a lot of people there. So you end up with MK coming in as the third largest party and taking 58 seats in parliament and being not inside the government of national unity, and also not even in charge of the province that they did win as the largest party in KwaZulu-Natal, and they are not in charge of that party. Now, their ability to kind of contribute is also limited by the fact that I think they were also surprised by how many seats that they got, also surprised by the extent of their kind of electoral gains. And so we're quickly scrambling and had a kind of pre-set narrative around, well, whatever the result is going to be, we're going to challenge the result. So bizarrely, we had this situation where a party that had come from nowhere, didn't have a list of people it wanted to be MPs, didn't really have a policy agenda other than what was kind of in this kind of manifesto, all of a sudden saying, oh, these results are unfair. And yet everybody else was saying, well, here's a party that's come from nowhere and surprised everyone, even themselves. So that's a really disruptive force. And I think that because of that disruptive force, and you can see the way in which they've backed down now in terms of their demands of, oh, well, if we're going to join this government, then Cyril Ramaphosa has to be removed from the presidency. That was their initial line, and now they've backed down on that. So have the EFF. So actually, some of these opposition parties are starting to see that, it's not really going to be much fun sitting in opposition when your parties and the way in which your politics is conducted is around clientelism and patronage. And you've got a president in charge who, I think at that very top level, the president and his advisors would have been very happy with just ANC-DA and the coalition, which had been discussed kind of even last year, bringing in the IFP as a party that has its stronghold base in KwaZulu-Natal. And I think that they, at that presidential level, would have been happy with that. But in order to kind of keep his own detractors within his own party on side, kind of just opened it up and said, well, whoever wants to join can come in. And in so doing, the president kind of called the bluff of some of those detractors. And it has left some of these kind of more disruptive parties out in the cold. And so to conclude, I think, on how long this GNU is going to last, I think that for the DA at least, it's now that they're in, if they leave, they're going to be the ones who perhaps are going to open the door to the EFF and MK to have a route into government. And it's not just their voting base, but it's also their funders who are desperate for that not to happen. And I think that weakness that they have of, their funding base saying you have to keep them out is also part of what allowed the ANC, as Stephen said, to really outmaneuver them in the negotiations. And, for a party of that strength to go into the negotiations demanding a representative number of seats that represents the proportion of the vote that they got, to then be squeezed right down almost to the bare minimum, that says quite a lot.
Thank you, Chris. We can see that there's a very exciting dynamic in South Africa. In the next, let's say, the coming weeks and months are going to be crucial. I mean, if I understood correctly, you seem to be quite positive that there will be, let's say, some pragmatic cooperation between the parties. at least for the time being going forward. Would that be a correct interpretation?
Yeah, I think that the Government of National Unity deal itself is really just a framework to say, okay, this is the broad makeup. And I think that going forward, even within that GNU, there's going to be cycles of deal making and negotiations, even within those parties of the government, over policy, and with multiple opportunities for kind of exit threats. But actually, at least for the foreseeable future, no one benefits from walking away at this early stage. It's going to be once we get into campaigning for the local elections in 2 years' time that you're going to start seeing people having to decide, well, is it better for us to stick with everybody else, or do we now break free and say, oh, all of these problems are because everybody else was rubbish and we were brilliant, and so that's why we've walked away from the GNU. So it's that question of political timing of, at what point do you benefit from leaving?
Great, thank you so much. Now I want to move on to you, Miss Malard. I mean, I know that you're not engaged in internal South African politics, but I'd still like to hear your analysis of how the election, how it was carried out, and the results is viewed from the EU, and what would be, I mean, from an EU perspective, what would be the steps that you would like to see from the South African government going forward?
Thank you, Amanda. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning from Brussels, the diplomatic service of the European Union. Look, first, I think we have followed here very closely the whole electoral process, the formation of the government. We looked at it with great interest. We see that this government of national unity is a real significant democratic success for South Africa. It has demonstrated the ability of the political parties to find compromises, and I think this commitment to democracy is really setting an example in a continent where increasingly we see authoritarian trends going on. So this government has so far established what seems to be a quite solid pact focus on economic growth, poverty alleviation, food securities. And we believe that it could positively impact the economy by accelerating reforms which have been pending, in particular in terms of infrastructure, energy, water, and also opening the country to foreign talent. We see that this cabinet is more gender balanced, which is positive, and that this cabinet also reflects the delicate balancing act that President Ramaphosa had to navigate among the different factions within ANC and with the parties which are now part of this government. As Christopher said, we will be looking closely at the 2026 local elections because the government will be under great pressure to deliver ahead of those elections. And we also expect the opposition to be quite emboldened and to seek to capitalize on growing populism and nationalism sometimes in the country. So in terms of meaning for the European Union, what does this new government mean for us and for our strategic partnership? I think we see that as a significant opportunity to strengthen our relationship and to go further in this strategic partnership. South Africa is the only strategic partner we have on the African continent. It's a partnership established 17 years ago. It has translated into numerous meetings at a political level and also technical level, because we have a long list of dialogues, thematic dialogues on which we work, political security, climate change, microeconomic, science, education and research, and so on. So the relationship is vibrant, is solid, with good basis, with a free trade agreement, with development assistance as well. And why have we decided to establish this strategic partnership is because South Africa is a very influential country in its region, in the continent, and also globally. And this brings me to what we expect in terms of foreign policies. Certainly a lot of continuity, because the foreign minister is from the ANC and the two deputy ministers as well. And we see how South Africa has been active over the past years. For example, at the UN Security Council in 2019-2020, as the chair of the African Union. In 2025, South Africa will chair the G20 with a summit in the country. Last year, it chaired the BRICS. So we expect South Africa to continue. And we see that the new minister has been quite active in making South Africa becoming a member of the International Criminal Court, and also in the case brought by South Africa against Israel at the International Court of Justice. In terms of economy, I would say the economic cluster is quite positive and cause of optimism for us. In particular, the fact that the Ministry of Mineral Resources and Energy has been split into two, with now energy merged with electricity under Minister Ramagopka. And we expect this to boost the energy security and the effort to end load shedding in the country. But we're quite happy to see that the Minister of Finance doesn't change, and that other ministers from DA in particular will be in charge of the Ministry of Environment, including climate change, where we expect some movement in the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is our flagship project in South Africa. I will not enter into further detail, but this was to answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come back to some of the issues on South Africa's foreign policy in a minute, because indeed it's a very interesting topic. And as I said at the beginning, South Africa is really growing in influence around the world. But I just want to come back to you, Stephen, to touch on, on the challenge of inequality, in the country. The World Bank ranked South Africa as the most unequal country in the world. 10% of the population holds 71% of the wealth, while the bottom 60% has just 7% of the assets. So do you believe that the new government will have a comprehensive strategy to tackle this issue? Because as has been mentioned, local elections are also on the horizon, so this will be crucial, going into these local elections as well.
Well, it's a very difficult one. I think we often talk of the triple threat of unemployment, inequality, and poverty in South Africa. I think despite the ANC's best efforts over 30 years, these remain pernicious problems. Yes, we have the most unequal society in the world, according to the Gini coefficient. We probably have one of the highest rates of unemployment, approaching the 40%. And massive youth unemployment in a population with a lot of youth. So you're having another generation that feels hopeless and feels that it's excluded, and doesn't have a stake in the society. We've also been downgraded by the credit rating agencies to junk status, so it's harder for us to borrow money on international markets. We've been grey listed by the Financial Action Task Force on suspicion of money laundering and supporting terrorist financing, which is not good for the country. So we've also had very low growth, under 1%, I think was last year. So we have a stagnating economy. We have an economy where minerals, while they're becoming more important for rare earth minerals and strategic minerals for the manufacture of batteries and other things for electric vehicles, for example, and cell phones. We do have those minerals, but traditional areas like diamond and gold are struggling. So we do, unfortunately, have a very unequal society. President Thabo Mbeki a few years talked about the two societies in one country. And you don't have to drive far if you're coming to Johannesburg and staying in Sandton. A mere 4 or 5 kilometers away, you'll be in the township of Alexandra, where people are living in shacks made out of plastic and corrugated iron. And I really feel for them. We're having a cold snap at the moment. Life is desperately hard for people. Will this government be able to tackle it? I think it has sincere intentions to do so, but governments don't really create jobs, businesses create jobs. So a major challenge will be for this government to cut red tape, to encourage small business, to encourage big business to invest, and really try and turn around this low growth. I mean, we have our competitors in African countries like Rwanda and Kenya that are Tanzania that are experiencing 4, 5, 6% growth. Ethiopia, South Africa seems to be stuck in the doldrums and not really moving forward. And the other challenge, of course, is you have a very small tax base, and you have a big redistributive burden. So you mentioned the levels of poverty. Many people don't pay tax at all, and in fact receive social grants from the government for childcare, for disability, for unemployment, and so on. And that bill is getting bigger and bigger. And the tax base is becoming, rather than becoming bigger with people moving into the middle class, there's some downward trends on the tax base because of immigration. And we're finding that skilled professionals are studying and training in South Africa, but finding their future elsewhere. I have two children at university who are very much looking at where are they going to go. And I think that's a big problem of a brain drain that's happening in the country. So these issues, I think, are what people voted on. And you mentioned at the beginning, there have been huge corruption scandals about the ANC. Christopher talked about the politics of patronage very much in play. And so on the economic front and the inequality front, we don't see, we are yet to see a viable plan that will really make inroads into those areas. Having said that, I think given the challenges that it faced from emerging from apartheid, I think the ANC did a pretty good job of trying to uplift people, but these problems have remained pernicious and structural and long-term.
And is this preventing foreign investment into the country? Is it a significant obstacle to get more foreign investment?
It is, because Delphine talked a little bit about load shedding and electricity. We've had 103 days when we haven't had power cuts in a row. But just this morning on the radio, they said be ready for load reduction. So they're going to become a thing. So why would a country want to invest in another country where there is unstable power supply, which has such a knock-on effect on everything from traffic to production of machine-made goods, etc., etc., etc. Not to mention how it affects the mood of people. I think we also have quite strict labor laws coming from the history of struggle and the ANC's past, its alliance with the Congress of the South African Trade Unions and the Communist Party. We have some of the best, probably, legislation in the world to protect workers, but business often feels that those laws make it very hard to hire and fire and restrict the ability of businesses to grow. So that's another factor. And I think the third factor is what we unfortunately saw in 2021 in the middle of the year, where we had massive riots in mainly the KwaZulu-Natal province, but also a bit in Gauteng, where I'm based. But we saw citizens on the rampage for 10 days or so. And a lot of that was around Jacob Zuma being sent to jail. And those people are the voters who have taken 15% or 17% off the ANC's numbers, and those votes have almost gone exclusively to Jacob Zuma's MK party. So while Ramaphosa has made a big policy move of trying to attract investment to South Africa, and he holds annual conferences, and definitely there is money coming in. But there are also factors that make people think twice and say, you know, Botswana is more stable, is safer, is going to give us a better return on our money. There's going to be protection for our investment. I mean, that's the other thing. The two populist parties, MK and EFF, are, you know, saying that there will be expropriation of land without compensation. What business is going to want to invest? So you have this willingness and this desire for more foreign investment, but all of these red flags as well.
Great, thank you very much, Stephen. I'm going to move away now from, let's say, domestic policies to foreign policy. With you, Chris, could you give us a sort of insight on what you expect from the new foreign minister? I mean, we've heard that perhaps it's just going to be continuity. Would you agree with that? I mean, what's going to be the priority? I mean, we know historically, I mean, multilateralism has been, you know, South Africa's has been important for South Africa, and using multilateral platforms as a way to do foreign policy has always been like a priority. So would you say there's going to be a continuity, or can we expect some change in some areas?
Thank you. I think that, as Delphine pointed out, I think that there's going to be a lot of continuity. And I think that those foreign policy or those foreign affairs missions and portfolios within the government have all been held by the ANC. You've got a new foreign minister, a new minister at the Department for International Relations and Cooperation in Ronald Lamola, who is less well known internationally than his predecessor was, Naledi Pandor, but I think is a guy who, in his former portfolio at the Ministry of Justice, did a very good job at running the department, was seen as a very competent minister, a rising star within the party, and one who perhaps has future leadership potential, but doesn't necessarily have a support base amongst where you would traditionally see ANC kind of some of the bigger beasts of the party currently, where they've drawn their support from. His political support will come from a different place, and that also kind of shows that there's some kind of intergenerational change within the party. And I think that this is kind of his appointment is perhaps an early signal of what the president wants to do in terms of succession building. And you know, it's not just the country that he's leaving behind, but it's the party. So in Ronald Lamola, we've got a very good individual being placed in that ministry. There's a lot of continuity as well. In the deputy minister, Alvin Bottes, will stay on. So I think that in terms of policy, what we're likely to see is a continuation, but perhaps a consolidation of the ministry itself. I think that he is an individual who is much more attached to the kind of the functional processes of being a minister. Naledi Pandor rejuvenated South Africa's foreign policy. Prior to her, there had been kind of two ministers, one for a long time, and Kwana Meti Mashabane, who had done very little during the Zuma years. Under the Zuma years, you had the rise of BRICS and kind of a slight change of direction of South African foreign policy, but little interest in really kind of continuing some of that kind of South Africa positioning on the world stage that had happened under Mbeki. Following her, you had Lindiwe Sisulu, who made some very strong but flip-flopping statements on various international and regional issues. And so when Naledi Pandor came in, there was a sense of kind of, okay, well, you know, South Africa is back, it's been taken seriously. She was very robust in her criticism of the West for kind of the West trying to put pressure on South Africa. And, you know, you had Anthony Blinken saying, oh, no, we're not trying to, you know, make you be for or against the Ukraine war. But it was clear that that's what the Americans were doing. And she said, no, we're free to be able to make up our own choices and pursue a position of non-alignment. But I think that under her, you also had a very kind of heightened level of personification of foreign policy. So she would act in a unilateral manner, sometimes tied to the party, sometimes not, sometimes tied to the country's national interest, sometimes not. And in a way that you ended up with South African foreign missions overseas kind of being sidelined by the minister in terms of relationships, particularly with kind of key powers, including US, UK, within Europe, and elsewhere. In a way that is, well, you're not really using the machinery that you have at your disposal. And that's something that has been kind of in process of kind of capacity building within the department itself, more training on economic diplomacy, more training of diplomats. There has been a lot of criticism over kind of political appointees being put in as ambassadors and high commissioners, and so there's kind of a big push for kind of the professionalization or re-professionalization of the Foreign Service, and so I think we've got a minister who's more likely to do that. In terms of kind of where it sits within the government of national unity, I think that there is agreement on things on Palestine and the desire for a ceasefire. I think that where the DA in its campaigning had taken a more pro-Israeli stance, that quickly abated when it realized that a lot of its voter base in the Western Cape is Muslim, and so there was a rollback on DA policy on that. But overall, I think that there will be a settling into a foreign policy that kind of has to reflect the government itself. The use of multilateral institutions to say, look, much like we have done in South Africa domestically, what we can do internationally is through multilateral agreements, find ways where it's okay for people who disagree with each other to still be able to cooperate and work together. I think that's more of the direction that they need to be taking. But finally, when you look at what South Africa can actually achieve in terms of its international relations, a lot of what it has done is it's not really the projection of power, either regionally or internationally. A lot of it is about taking positions on things and then operating within multilateral fora to build alliances around the position that it has taken. And when you look at other portfolios that have an international mandate, for example, defense, excuse me, you've got a Minister of Defense now, in Angie Motshekga, who was widely criticized in her previous portfolio, isn't seen as the most competent of ministers, being put in charge of that department. And there are external deployments of South African troops in DRC and in northern Mozambique. But these are very, very weak deployments. And what's left in Mozambique is largely around the repatriation of material from their mission there back to South Africa. And the operations in DRC are also quite controversial here, especially news of South African soldiers being very sadly being killed. So you've got a minister in one portfolio who I think you'll see some consolidation around key issues, less high personality politics, less kind of grandstanding on the world stage, and a much more kind of toned down line, also being reined in by coalition partners, but then other portfolios less so. And then perhaps I'll hand over to Stephen to talk about the Russia connection, but also the quality of again, the emphasis on the prioritization of the economic ministries, where actually you've got Parks Tau, who's in charge of trade, industry, and competition. He's actually very, very good. He was a well-respected mayor of Johannesburg. He took on a lot of international positions in intra-city, kind of international kind of city bodies. And so he'll be welcomed in that position. So you can see the emphasis on, it's economics, it's trade, it's trying to attract international capital, and other areas of international affairs will kind of take a back seat.
Thank you. That was super. That was a super interesting analysis. I am gonna come back to you, Stephen, because I do want to ask about Russia, and then I'm gonna come to you, Delphine. So what I understood is that there's an expectation for continuity, more or less, in foreign policy. So I'm guessing this would apply to, I mean, South Africa is what they class as a neutral position, vis-a-vis Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Do you agree with this, Stephen? I mean, I know Russia is one of your expert topics, or could we see a slight adjustment, where perhaps Ukraine would gain more support, from South Africa? I mean, it's no secret that Kiev would like to see a stronger support, from South Africa, particularly vis-a-vis the President Zelensky's peace formula. Do you see any change at all, or do you agree more or less with the previous speaker, with Chris?
I do agree there's going to be a lot of continuity. The fundamental policy is not really going to change. We actually saw an op-ed in the Sunday Times, the South African Sunday Times, over the weekend by Minister Lamola, where Gaza was mentioned once, but really as an aside and in another context. And the Ukraine war was talked about in terms of its economic effects on the developing world, increasing prices and food security and so forth. So we may see a little bit less stridency in Lamola, but of course, you know, certainly on Israel-Palestine, he was very prominent in the case at the International Court of Justice, due to his position in the Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Development, and he was one of the faces of that, along with Naledi Pandor. So it's interesting that that was hardly mentioned in this opinion piece by him. Is that a signal that things are going to change? In terms of Russia, you know, South Africa has claimed non-alignment, but done things which have put that into question. Certainly in the first year of the war, whether it was holding military exercises with Russia and China off the coast of South Africa, or the mysterious circumstances of the docking of the Lady R ship in Simonstown, and whether it was high-profile ministers going to high-profile conferences in Russia. The ANC sent a delegation, Parliament sent a delegation to various conferences. And while it said it was non-aligned, it was interpreted as leaning towards Russia. Then South Africa was instrumental in what has become known as the African Peace Initiative, where a number of presidents, including Ramaphosa, went to both Kiev and Moscow, or I think it may have been St. Petersburg, but really not much has come out of that, and the war still rages, as we know, at present. So South Africa did attend Zelensky's peace conference in Switzerland, but was one of the many countries from the developing South that did not sign on to the communique. So, and I spoke to some officials before that conference. They were a little doubtful about what their position should be. There was, they said, well, they were expecting the presidential inauguration on the day. So they were a little bit ambivalent, I think, about that conference in particular. I think South Africa still remains engaged and wants to play a role if called upon to do so, but we haven't really seen much positive come out of the African Peace Initiative. And yeah, to me, the conflict is still not ripe for resolution at the moment. Both sides are not interested in talking and are hoping to improve their position on the battlefield.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. I'll come back to you again in a minute, but I want to come to Delphine. I know it's normally the policy of the EU not to, let's say, I'm not sure if interfere is the right word, in the foreign policies of other countries. But would you be able to share your, I mean, your impressions of where South Africa, I mean, places itself vis-a-vis the Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I mean, South Africa, as was mentioned, is also a member of the BRICS, has close relations with China. What sort of discussions, if any, go on within the EU framework vis-a-vis South Africa's role in helping bring an end to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
Well, look, it's a very interesting question. As mentioned by the two other invitees, I think South Africa has its position has evolved since the beginning of the war, and for us, we see that it has become a bit more nuanced. Indeed, South Africa never formally condemned Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, but at several occasions, President Ramaphosa was very clear in recalling the principles of the UN Charter and territorial integrity and sovereignty of countries. We appreciated the South Africa leadership in the Africa Peace Initiative last year in June, and the visit to Ukraine and to Russia by 7 leaders led by President Ramaphosa to the two countries. And from that time, from end of July last year, we saw a very active participation of South Africa in the National Security Advisors meetings organized by Ukraine, which led to the organization of the Peace Summit for Ukraine mid-June in Switzerland. And for us, this was very encouraging. And we know that South Africa has been particularly active on 2 issues, prisoners of war and Ukrainian children deported to Russia, trying to make things advance on those 2 fronts. And that is something very positive. So Sydney Mufamadi, the National Security Advisor, was in Switzerland. And indeed, South Africa, as such, did not sign the final statement of this summit. But we heard from what they said in the press, they didn't sign because of the presence of Israel, and because Israel also signed this document, and also because of the language regarding the threat or the use of nuclear weapons in this statement. The language, according to South Africa, was too narrow because it was only prohibition of nuclear weapons in the Ukraine context and not larger than the Ukraine context. These, we understand, were the 2 reasons why South Africa decided not to sign the statement of the summit in Switzerland. But altogether, I think there is more than unites us than divides us on Ukraine. And we're very happy to see that we can discuss this very regularly with our Southern African counterparts.
Thank you. And I agree with you that there's more that unites and divides, and South Africa has played a very important role in the Bring Kids Back initiative of President Zelensky and many other areas, which is to be commended. I'd like to come back now to you again, Stephen, actually, to come back to Russia. Can you sort of explain why Russia remains so popular in South Africa? I mean, is this just because of the historical legacy, or is it because of Russian, let's say, disinformation or whatnot that seems to appear quite regularly in your media? What is this about Russia's, ongoing popularity?
Well, I think there are a number of strands to this, one of which is the very strong support that the Soviet Union gave to liberation movements in Southern Africa, including, of course, the African National Congress itself, and a bit of nostalgia for those days of the Cold War when Russia was providing diplomatic support, money, weapons, training, etc. A number of the older generation of the ANC had training in the former Soviet Union, and those ties, some of them speak Russian, so some of those ties have definitely endured. I think the message about a multipolar world, standing up against Western imperialism, rebalancing the international system is something that has a lot of resonance in South African politics, and a lot of affinity for those positions. South Africa wants a newly made world, a more fair world, a world where the developing countries are given a say and a voice and power commensurate with their numbers. Whether it is exactly the way that Russia sees it is up for question, but there's definitely an understanding of that language. I mean, Ramaphosa, yes, has been supportive of peace, but also very early on in the conflict said this is a war that NATO has brought upon itself because it's threatening Russia, and Russia doesn't. Its security concerns need to be taken into account. So yes, there has been a shift. I absolutely agree, but there's also. So there's that. Then there is how hard South Africa worked to get into BRICS, and the support of Russia was very important in doing that. And South Africa has been an active member of BRICS and has interacted a lot with Russia because the BRICS, certainly when it was just 5, tended to meet on the margins of the UN, on the margins of the G20, etc. And I think those relationships have grown. We've also had Zuma's not in power, but during his time in power, he had frequent visits to Russia and a very good relationship with Putin. So I think there's this sort of nostalgia, this agreement or a consensus that the world needs to change the way it does business, which resonates. The anti-imperialism, I've said, and a desire to balance relations with the West with other partners and not be too dependent. So it's not really economic. If you look at the trade numbers, they are minuscule between South Africa and Russia compared to South Africa, China, or South Africa, Europe, or South Africa, US. So there's a lot of room for that. I think the relationship is strong for other reasons rather than economic ones, as I've outlined. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. I want to bring one of the questions that's in the chat box. Maybe you can answer this. It's about the statement that was made, I think, by either you or Stephen about a bloated cabinet. He's basically asking whether you can clarify this, because there's other countries in the world who have similar numbers who function. I mean, Australia is mentioned, in Canada. Maybe it's a sort of colonial thing to have these huge cabinets, huh? But what would you say? What would you say to that?
Was that to me?
Whoever wants to pick up on that, either you or Chris, I think, because one of you talked about the bloated cabinet.
Yeah, well, I'll just say that it is very large. It's not all that much larger than the previous cabinet, but it's unwieldy. Getting consensus is going to be difficult. The number of deputy ministers is also huge, and so it becomes costly. Is it unworkable? Well, I think we have to give it a chance and see. But it certainly is a lot of opinions to take into account. And maybe that's the nature of a coalition government. Maybe Chris wants to just pick up from.
Yeah, I agree. I think, look, South African governments can be quite big. But what you tend to see is a split between those that are ministerial appointments or departments that are kind of highly strategic, particularly kind of the economic cluster, and then those that are kind of patronage appointments where you're handing someone a portfolio as a thank you very much for your support for the president, or if they're a detractor from the president, it's well, look. I'm not going to put you in charge of anything really important, but I'm going to put you in charge of a department that has a lot of opportunities for patronage appointments in itself and a lot of money-making opportunities. So you have this kind of variation of what the departments can be used for anyway. And you have some that are kind of inherently corrupt And you do tend to get people kind of offered those departments as a way of, well, here you go, you go play around with this this department, particularly somewhere like cooperation of traditional governance, COCTA, is one where you tend to see that kind of behavior occurring. In terms of the size, I think one of the challenges will be is that you do have a lot of people now around the table. As Stephen pointed out earlier, there isn't really a set plan on how to bring the economy through to a trajectory of strong economic growth. And so more voices around the table will mean more kind of or less cohesion. The other thing is that you do have to find ways of, or the president has had to find ways of offering appointments to coalition partners, while also being able to offer appointments to senior ANC officials who would have otherwise had ministerial appointments, but now he's got to offer those ministries to other people. So he's got to expand the number of deputy ministers. So that's going to be a challenge. And then finally, one of the issues that is going to be faced by the size of this cabinet is that you're going to have some real eager beavers in there who are desperate to show that, having been given a new department, they're going to start racing ahead. And we've already seen some departments coming out with announcements saying, oh, we're going to do this, that, and the other. And then ministers within the presidency saying, hey, guys, hold on. Like, this is government by cabinet, and we all have to move together. And that's going to be, I think, part of the challenge, and where, this accusation of, this unwieldiness of it is that you're going to, the DA will want to show that, having campaigned on this mantra of we do governance really well, look at the Western Cape, the biggest issue that the country faces isn't necessarily around ideology, it's around governance, and what we can do is govern really well. They're going to want to demonstrate that very early on in those departments. And what the rest of the GNU partners are going to want is for this, for a cohesive coalition where everything gets discussed by everybody, which is also quite inherent within ANC modus operandi anyway. One of the issues that we've had in terms of economic policy from the ANC isn't necessarily that there's kind of a lack of strategy. Is that the ANC internally is an inherently democratic structure where ideas go out to the branches, where everybody gets an opportunity to input onto policy formation anyway. So the ANC has this culture of discussion, and everybody gets their voice heard. And that's going to be brought to this GNU. And so the idea that you're going to have, like I say, these kind of new ministers coming in and being able to move at breakneck speed is going to be very unrealistic. There's going to be imposed upon it this culture of discussion, and we all move together, and everybody has to agree on everything before we can move forward. And that's going to be what's going to be, why we talk about it as being unwieldy, because you're going to need consensus on everything for any little thing to be able to move forward.
Thank you. You make it sound like an extremely difficult path going forward to find all of these different consensus. So I see there's a lot of challenges out there. Unfortunately, we have to end this webinar now. 1 hour went by very quickly. I feel like there were still many issues and topics that we could have covered. I'm very sorry to the colleague from SAIIA, Gustavo, who wrote extensively in the chat box about foreign policy. I think, Gustavo, we need to organize another webinar just on South Africa's foreign policy, because there was a lot of issues that we couldn't get to. I would like to thank all of you for coming and speaking today. I found this conversation really insightful and fascinating. We can see that South Africa is really an important player in the world, and seems to be increasingly so. It's going to have a major impact on the, let's say, the new world order or international order that is coming. I mean, maybe some people don't want it to come, but it's coming, and South Africa is going to be a major major player there. This definitely won't be the last conversation or event that EPC holds on South Africa. So please keep your eye on our events schedule to see what's in the pipeline. Thank you again for all of you for joining us, for sharing your expertise, and I wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.